Cool. So, this is a very squashed version of me. So let me give you a little bit of background. I am an accountant. It's kind of one of those, it sounds like I've fallen into remission, like Alcoholics Anonymous. I spent 10 years of my life working in an accountancy firm and jumped ship in 2000 into startup land, and essentially been working in startups for the last 15 years of my life. Over that period of time, I've worked in multiple different parts. So I've either worked in them, started them, I've raised money for them, or I've invested in them. And to some degree, what I describe is I'm a tradesman of many and a master of none. Apart from actually, ironically now, Accelerators, which I've been doing for 5 years. I was very fortunate to bump into a guy called David Cohen, who helped set up TechStars when I was a venture capitalist. And what I was trying to do was I discovered that actually investing in early stage businesses was extremely hard and difficult. And I typically wrote seed checks of about 200,000 euros. And the last seed check I ever wrote as a venture VC, I actually said, why don't I write not one check, but why don't I write 10? And I wrote 10 checks for 20,000 euros instead of one big one. And I worked with the teams for 3 to 4 months. And that was kind of the very, very first accelerator that I set up, which was called the Difference Engine, which has been confined to history a very long time ago. But it was in the middle of nowhere. Well, actually, I got a sweary version of that. But essentially, it was the arse end of nowhere. Interestingly, anybody ever heard of a business called Postmates? Well, Postmates technically came out of that accelerator. And as a result, a number of investors came to me afterwards and said, actually, that was pretty cool. Actually, can we help you support a private version of that? Because it was all public money. And essentially, I set up something called Springboard. It was originally set up in Cambridge, and subsequently went to London, care of our friends at Google, when they first opened campus, and gave me space. And subsequently, over the next couple of years, I ran a few more programs, and then just over 2 years ago, TechStars, who had originally helped me set up my first program, came along and said, we don't want to be just in the US anymore, we want to be international. Can you help us do that? And essentially, so Springboard turned into TechStars London just over 2 years ago. In that intervening period, we've run 3 programs, and we're just about to start on our 4th. What I also discovered was when I first set up that first program was most people put me down as a complete nutter, an idiot. But fortunately for me, I actually had enough success that enough people came to me and said, we would like to do that as well. And so I helped set up, I think, 12 other programs in the following 18 months' time. And so suddenly, instead of me being just this lunatic, I ended up creating a cult of lots of accelerators across Europe. And it wasn't just me, there were lots of other people. But for those that take a view of don't tell anybody how you do what you do, actually it's much easier when everybody's talking about it, not just you, to actually help start a movement. And whether that's an IoT or whether that's an accelerators, it's equally true. So let's talk about what accelerators are. Or as I described, I used to know what an accelerator was. I have no idea what it is now, because everything I see that seems to move at the minute seems to have the tag accelerators added to it. But TechStars started in 2006. So it's just about to come up to its 9th or 10th birthday. And it was set up by 2 guys primarily, David Cohen and Brad Feld. David's the one on the left, and Brad's the one on the right. And it was set up in Boulder. The amazing thing about Boulder is only 100,000 people that walk around in flip-flops and at the minute smoke too much weed because it's legal. No, actually, they don't, or they do. And quietly, TechStars started in 2006 and ran for 2 or 3 years on its own in Boulder. And then over the next 2 or 3 years, it added a few more programs. Boston, Seattle, New York. Then we did a program with Microsoft in Seattle, and then subsequently Nike. And around about that time, that's when Springboard joined the TechStars family. That was just over 2.5 years ago. There were about 5 programs. Today, TechStars now runs 18. Just over 2 years ago, TechStars had no international presence. Today, it runs 4 programs internationally. I would probably say to you that I would expect over the next 2 years that that number on the screen will probably double. I also think that probably most of those will come internationally, because we strongly believe that there are more opportunities for more entrepreneurs globally than exist in just the US alone. We genuinely believe that entrepreneurship is a global phenomenon. We have currently about 600 companies inside our portfolio. We're adding almost 200 a year now. And when we double in the next couple of years, that could be 400. So the numbers being involved in this are massive. But in the context of what's happening globally, I think it's still a very, very small piece of the action. So this is a really interesting article by a good friend of mine called Mike Butcher. It was written on June the 24th, 2011, when he said, there's a bubble in accelerators. That was 4 years ago. And since then, there has now gone on to be over 1,000 accelerators around the world. And actually, as I describe what an accelerator is and how it's changing, is actually all sorts of weird and wonderful things happening. So one of the things we discovered in our journey was working with the right corporates actually has a profound impact. Actually, I think that actually vertical programs, when they're run with the right corporate, actually can be even more impactful than a standard accelerator, which is pretty controversial. But it has to be done on the right terms. So our very first program we ran was with Microsoft. And then subsequently we did it with Nike. What was really different about those 2 businesses was Microsoft is from a tech background. So in theory, it knew about lean, it knew about doing stuff over short periods of time. But we still were impactful. Actually, there was a team that was actually spun out, which actually were a bunch of people from Microsoft that sneaked out and actually started a new business, and then subsequently was acquired back by Microsoft 2 years later. So it demonstrated that even large tech corporates actually struggle sometimes with innovation. What really surprised us was our next one was with Nike. The impact that we had when we were working with Nike was significantly larger. Because what we suddenly forget is the stuff that we do day to day is a step change away from how corporates work in traditional environments. The idea of doing anything in a 90-day program and actually being impactful was just unheard of. And we suddenly realized in our world, and you'll understand this, we had hit product market fit. Working with the right corporates and getting real fundamental engagement suddenly was profoundly interesting. So we now work with 9 corporates in TechStars, which include people like Disney in entertainment. We work with Qualcomm in robotics. We work with Barclays in fintech. If you get the right buy-in, and it has to be at a C-level, your ability to be impactful to a team can be profound. The way we judge ourselves and how we think about can we be really inherently valuable is how many of those teams actually end up with a pilot project at the end of the 13 weeks. In Barclays, The very first program, 7 out of 10, actually had meaningful pilots. The idea of actually having a pilot with Barclays suddenly unlocks your ability to raise further capital. The reason why there was 7, not 10, was 2 of those teams started as fintech businesses. By the end, they were ad tech businesses. So we're not necessarily trying to shoehorn them in necessarily specifically for the benefit of Barclays. We're still trying to work on behalf of the startup. And the 10th one, well, it blew up, like most startups inside an accelerator on occasions. So corporate programs can be invaluable if you get the right corporate with the right attitude. The reason why I think this is really interesting is if we stand back and think about global expansion and entrepreneurship, and you think about the number of billion-dollar venture funds which exist outside of the Valley, there are very, very few. However, I challenge you and say, if you think about the number of countries around the world and the number of businesses that have a market cap of over $1 billion, I would probably say 90% of the world's population exists in a country that has $1 billion business. Being able to access and leverage their resources and their client base and their knowledge, I think is a really interesting opportunity. That creates real unfair advantage to startups themselves. Accelerators have also gone far beyond digital. They're actually now, I've seen life science, I've seen entertainment, I've seen film versions of this. I think what's also interesting is if you take the statement which Mark Andreessen talks about, which is software is taking over the world, let me describe that a different way. Drugs discovery, pharma, are actually now moving to digital. You don't sit with petri dishes anymore. You actually run analysis using software. Many offline capabilities are now being virtualized and put onto software. That allows you to iterate much faster and harder and using digital technology. And so actually the number of non-traditional digital businesses that are actually now being exposed to software is increasing significantly. That in itself opens the opportunity for using models such as accelerators to be impactful. Pre-accelerators and post-accelerators. Pre-accelerators. There's an amazing, there's two really interesting models I've seen. There's an amazing accelerator in London called Entrepreneur First, which kind of describes itself as a pre-accelerator. I don't necessarily think that's true. But essentially what it does is it's a people accelerator. It takes people who don't ordinarily have a team, nor do they have an idea, but it helps to build that around. It's a 6-month program, and what it does is it takes the smartest talent from UK and actually now European universities and actually helps them build teams around themselves. And then it helps them identify opportunities. And then it takes them on an acceleration journey. I personally believe this is probably the most exciting accelerator on the planet today. And the reason why it is because what they spend their life trying to do is encourage the top 10% smartest students in the UK to actually start their own businesses instead of going and working for Goldman Sachs or McKinsey. Like, that sort of stuff really moves the needle when it comes to growth. If you can get the top 10% graduates from your universities starting their own business, because you know when you start your own business, you will never work for somebody else again. That has a lifetime impact. I personally think that's super interesting. There is a similar version of that which exists in Italy, and they also describe themselves as People Accelerator. I actually think that this is a really interesting model, particularly for ecosystems which are slightly earlier in the system, and there are fewer formed teams around these sorts of things. And lastly, something called a growth accelerator. I won't put a name to it, but I am aware that London is just about to get one of these. And it's essentially for businesses which are after seed but before Series A. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to bridge the gap between you have a product, you have product market fit, but you're probably not just big enough to get to Series A. And so what they're trying to do is identify the smartest teams that actually are on the right trajectory but haven't got there yet. And how do they increase the speed at which you get there and therefore have the opportunity for potentially Series A funding? No different from the startups that we work with, I personally believe that accelerators should actually self-examine what they're doing. And there was a model that was built by Y Combinator and TechStars. But I think no different from any other startup, I think we genuinely should be looking at where do other opportunities exist? How does this work? How do we change what an accelerator looks like for the benefit of those that participate in it? What are the things that should be done before an accelerator to make it even more impactful, but equally, what can you do after an accelerator to make those invaluable? Hardware is another really good example of this. I tried to do a hardware accelerator 3 years ago. It was an unmitigated disaster. But I now know what I did wrong. And I tried to be impactful. What I realized was when you get beyond a digital environment, actually hardware, it's a simple statement, is hard. Actually working with the right partners actually can be impactful. I strongly believe, and I have seen hardware accelerators since, the model is different. It tends to be much more driven over 6 months. There's a really good business called PCH, based out of Ireland, that actually does do this. And what's really interesting about them is they actually invest in the startups and actually give them capacity and access to their manufacturing capabilities in China. And that, and an alignment of interests and goals between them as a manufacturer and them as an investor, actually has now found really interesting dynamics. Interestingly, up until quite recently, until Radio Shack went bust, they actually had distribution capability as well through Radio Shack. But it demonstrates that there is really interesting opportunities coming about elsewhere. This is my favorite slide of all time. This is venture capital. I think what you need to do is you need to step back and think about that actually we spend our life talking about how startups are changing and how quickly they're evolving. I think venture is ripe for disruption as well. I think accelerators were a representation and a version of that, which interestingly happened now almost 10 years ago. Yeah? I don't think we should be scared equally to actually be disruptive to the model that we've already built. I think we need to be open to the idea of change. I think we need to be open to the idea that actually maybe there are other models that can exist. There's an interesting discussion currently going on in London about is there an opportunity to build accelerators for Series A teams. The interesting thing about Series A, and for those that want a reference, they should look up Sherry Kutu's doing something called a scale-up report. And they basically say after you've fixed that early stage in the market, after you've fixed early stage seed funding and being able to make things grow, the next natural blockage in the system is how do you get teams Series A funded? How do you help them scale? Similar to the model which I described earlier around a growth accelerator. I think the other thing which is happening in venture, which kind of indicates this, is there's a shift away from traditional financial people towards what they call operators. If you look at Andreessen Horowitz, it's built of a whole portfolio of operators. I think at last count they now have 90 employed people who are specifically there to support the entrepreneurs inside their portfolio. And probably the most radical thing they do is none of the partners actually get paid. all of the partners have passed on their salary to allow them to build operational staff. The only money that they make is they make in carry. They make a lot more carry, but they've actually passed over on their salary because they believe that actually operational support of their startups is much more valuable to them. The model itself hasn't necessarily proven itself at this point in time, but it demonstrates that the whole market at all the different stages inside venture, accelerators being one part, growth capital being another, actually are changing throughout the system. So, for anybody who has an interest or knows anybody around accelerators, I personally think that what's going to happen over the next 5 years is going to fundamentally change what accelerators are. To some extent, I would argue that most accelerators today are run on a pretty casual basis. I think most accelerators today, because they're relatively cheap to set up, relative to, say, for example, a venture fund, actually are, sometimes you run it, sometimes we don't. I think what's going to happen personally in the market is the market is going to split. I think there are going to be those that actually do it and do it exceptionally well, and then there'll be what I call casual accelerators. I think for those that are actually, as a startup, looking at potentially doing an accelerator, you need to figure out which side of that line you're actually working with. I think what will happen is I think government will become increasingly more interested in this, and hence the economic regeneration element. For someone like TechStars and Y Combinator, like, this is what we do, and we do it really well. When you run a program 18 times every year, you learn a lot. You learn a hell of a lot about what works and what doesn't. We run small experiments constantly across our network to identify where are the really cool things that really are impactful and where are the things that don't. But essentially, we can make money as an investor, and we make money for our investors. I think what's going to happen in that process is actually the dirty little secret about accelerators are it's really hard to make money on them. The key to an accelerator is actually identifying the really smartest teams that actually can go for high growth. And so there's a number of accelerators which are essentially setting up funds. 500 startups set up funds for themselves from day zero. TechStars has recently, after had smaller funds, has just recently launched a $150 million fund. The rumor on the street is that Y Combinator are just about to close something of a $3 billion venture fund for their growth capabilities. The opportunity that we have as accelerators is unfair access and knowledge about teams that other people don't. And to this point, very few people have taken access or opportunity around this. There's examples of this in Europe, and the other one which I'm partner in is 11, which actually has not the same magnitude of a fund, but it demonstrates that actually the next wave of models is not just purely about the first money in, but actually the following on capital. So the thing I would do is I'd say to you is challenge you to say, don't do what you're doing, but skate to where the puck is going, not where it's at today. If you can't raise the fund afterwards, can you sell your rights to those optionalities, those shares that you already have? Can you act as the front end of a fund for somebody else? Can they give you a cut of their upside? I think that access at that really early stage is really interesting. I also would argue that working with corporates on the right terms can actually be hugely impactful, because actually most corporates really don't care much for those small equity stakes at the front end. They actually have very little value. When you look at a business that's worth $1 billion, having small amounts of equity in very small businesses has little value to them. But those little amounts could be profoundly interesting to you. Thank you very much.